Before we get going, I'd like if we just all stand and put your hand over your heart. If you have a jacket on, you may need to put it inside, but find the heartbeat, feel the heartbeat. I'll be honest, mine is beating kind of fast right now. I don't know that I've ever spoken in front of 300 people before, but find the heartbeat and feel it. We can so easily get focused on the external. We get focused on, oh, he's got a weird nose, or, oh, he's tall, dark, and handsome. I'm not, And we forget that what keeps every body going, regardless of what it looks like, is the same small organ on the left side of the chest that pumps. And if ever anything happens to the heart, our bodies stop functioning, and we begin dying. We might have a heart attack, lose our life, or maybe we just feel fatigue and we're tired and don't have the energy to do the things we used to do. And in the same way, every one of us men, we can get focused on doing things, focused on running around at work, focused on making ends meet for our families, focused on ministry, focused on sports or social events, and we forget that what really keeps a man going is something deep inside of him that has got to stay connected with God. And if ever we lose that connection, we as men begin to function improperly. We begin to die. And we tend to look to things to try to make us feel life again. Maybe we pour ourselves even more into work. But we tend to turn to our sexuality because of how tied in our sexuality is with our whole being. Some level or another, we take it out sexually because we're disconnected with God. I don't know where you're at this morning. If maybe you're one of the older men here maybe you're walking in freedom and you're just wanting to know how to better walk with other men. Maybe you're not walking in freedom. Maybe you're a younger guy here you're just beginning to feel things for the first time. Maybe you're 15, 16, and you don't even know terminology to some of the things you're feeling. Or maybe you're like most of us, somewhere in between there, struggling with lust or pornography, or I don't know what it is. But every one of us has male sexuality. And every one of us, when we're disconnected with God at the core of our being, it affects our sexuality. And over the next hour, as we're talking here, I'm just going to periodically have us put our hands back on our hearts, feel the heartbeat, take a breath, and realize that when we're talking about sexual sin and sexual struggles, there's usually more going on than what meets the eye. You can have a seat. Some of us were talking earlier, Dad and I were talking with Amos, and thinking, well, maybe it would be good to start off here by defining some terms, just so we know what we're talking about. Because there's sexuality, and when I refer to sexuality, I'm talking about the things that make us men, make us the fact that we're not women, and that there's biological components, there's the way our bodies are structured physically that make up the difference. Then there's sex, the act of sexual intercourse with another lady, another person. Then there's lust. That's a real ambiguous term, isn't it? What's lust? Lust, I've heard it defined different ways. One way is wanting something that isn't yours. I'm specifically, when I refer to it, I'm talking about God has designed sex for a purpose. And when I'm looking at a woman or desiring sex in a way that is not the way God designed it, then that's lust. Then there's pornography. And when I talk about pornography, I might reference porn, looking at porn or whatever. I'm talking everything from someone who's struggling every day, maybe every hour, just wants to go on the internet and watch porn, all the way to someone who might just struggle with an ad they see on a billboard driving around. So there's a wide range of, my session title is Finding the Root of My Addiction to Porn. Well, you might not be struggling every day, every hour. But if you struggle with, you see something and you can't let that go and you're wondering why, then this session is just as much for you. Then there's the term masturbation. I don't know how many of you have heard that term before. But there's different elements to being aroused sexually. There's the cognitive element that happens in the brain, and pornography is a huge part of that. There's another element, that's the physical element, physical stimulation. And masturbation is just stimulating yourself and arousing yourself sexually with your own hands, with your own body. And so I don't know, maybe you didn't know the terms to that, but maybe you struggle with that. And so whenever I reference masturbation, that's what I'm talking about. Some of us don't struggle with that. Some of us do struggle with that and don't realize what it's called. And it's always a challenge with a group this big. How do we talk about things plainly so that we all know we're not the only ones without adding to somebody else's struggle? And so I thought it might be valuable to clarify a few things so that we can know, because I'm going to reference some things. I think Dad referenced some things last night, and he'll probably reference more. And if we don't know what we're talking about exactly, we might not know the impact of what we're saying. About a year ago, I was finishing up my manuscript for my book, Live Free. And Live Free, you probably saw it out there. It's just a conversation with the reader about my own journey of getting into pornography and struggling with masturbation and finding freedom from that. And it's a conversation about that as well as the greater aspects of male sexuality. What does it look like to live free in our male sexuality in a world that's bound and bent to cause us to stumble and live against God's design, right? About a year ago, I was finishing that up. I had just finished the manuscript. It was in my office in our apartment. Just have a little 6x6 closet that we put a desk in, and that's my office. And I was in there, just finished a chapter, if I remember correctly, kind of sat back, and my phone buzzed. And I picked up my phone and saw the text, and it said, "Valentine's Day is around the corner. I am fun and ready for sex. Want to hook up?" And I saw the text. I was, what in the world? Where did that come from? I don't know how many of you have gotten emails like that in your junk mail, some advertisement to a dating site or something. And so the way it was written, I knew right away that it probably wasn't actually a real person, just kind of a text blast that was sent out. I deleted it and put it down. But there was something inside of me that was kind of awakened or excited. And I found myself even getting a little aroused. And I was on a break. I was done with my chapter. I went over, checked my email, and kind of meandered into the junk mail and was cruising down there just to see, what else might show up. And then a thought hit me, just, Asher, what are you doing? Just outside my door was my 1-year-old son. Well, he's 1 now. He was newborn then. Laying, sleeping. Thought of my other 2 boys, my wife. Did I really want to just throw everything that God had given me away with a fling with someone else? And that's not even a real person. Why did this excite me so much? And I was really puzzled because Teresa and I have a really good marriage. Sex with her has been better than I ever imagined it would be, especially as someone who struggled with pornography, who struggled with masturbation. I kind of lived with a sense of guilt that maybe somehow I had ruined all of that. And it's not. It's very fulfilling. Why? Why did this catch me so off guard? Why did I feel so awakened at the potential of a secret affair or something? And I just closed the computer. Thought about that for a little bit. There was a young man once who lived in a very poor part of town, poor part of city. How many of you are familiar with cities? I come from LA. Goshen, I think, is a city, but I have yet to see it. There's a man that came from a very poor part of town. His dad had a catering business, and they would cater for people in upper classes. And so as his name got around, he started gaining some influence. But they lived on the poorest side of town, and they were poor themselves. Their business struggled from year to year. And this young man and one of their assistants were sent out to cater a luncheon once. And so they're driving into the downtown area, and they couldn't find the building they were looking for. Their Google Maps wasn't working very well. And because they're millennials, they didn't know how to get there without Google Maps. The young man the assistant that was with this young man, he remembered, hey, we're close to City Hall. Let's just stop into City Hall and look up the business in the directory. And so, okay, sure. They go into City Hall, and so they walk up to the secretary, and they're going to look up the business, find where they need to go. The city sheriff walks in, and he recognizes them. Oh. And as he walks over to meet them, he says, you are the mayor the people have been looking for. And the young man is kind of taken aback. What do you mean, I'm the mayor? I'm a nobody from the other side of town. I'm just here to cater a lunch. And he says, no, you're the mayor, and here's how I know you're the mayor. Here's how you'll know you're going to be the mayor. The place you're looking for is around the block. It's 3 buildings down. It's on the 7th floor. And when you get there, you're going to realize they're having a city council meeting. And as you walk in, they're going to ask you for your thoughts on the subject they're talking about. And you're going to share what comes to mind, and they're going to be so impressed with your answer, they're going to use it. And that's how you'll be the mayor. And so the guy's like, okay, that was weird. And they walk out, and they drive around the corner, 3 buildings down, go up the 7th floor. They're hauling their stuff in, and sure enough, it's a city council meeting. And the council members are debating and talking, and they look over to the young man and say, hey, what's your thoughts? And the young man gives it such a cunning and wise response. The council members love it. And everybody that's standing around observing say, wait a minute, who is this? Isn't he from that poor side of town? Is he a council member? Now, you may realize this story resembles the story of Saul in 1 Samuel 9. Saul came from the smallest clan in all of Israel. In fact, the scripture says he came from the least important clan in all of Israel. And he just took care of his father's donkeys, his father's livestock. And one of the donkeys had gotten lost, and he and a helper are going to find it. They can't find it. They hear that there's a seer in the town, and so they go to meet this seer. It's Samuel. As Saul's walking up to Samuel, the Lord tells him he's the king the people have been asking for. And so Samuel tells him this, you're going to be the king. And Saul's, why do you say that to me? Aren't I from the least important clan in all of Israel? And Samuel tells Saul, here's one of the signs on your way home. You're going to be met by prophets. They're going to come down, and you're going to prophesy with them. And sure enough, it came true. He's heading home. The prophets come down. The Spirit of God rushes on Saul, and he prophesies. And people standing who knew him from before step back, and they're, wait a minute, isn't this the son of Kish? Is he among the prophets? And that became a saying in the day. Is Saul among the prophets? And that sign, there were several signs that Samuel had given. It was a sign that God had transformed Saul into a new man. And he was now, Samuel said, you can do whatever the situation calls for because God is with you. And just imagine for a little bit what that's like. How many of you feel unimportant? It's okay, raise your hand. Okay? What if you're in the poorest part of town, or you're the least important clan in all of Israel? And now you are overwhelmed by the Spirit of God, and you're given permission to do whatever the situation calls for. Would that make you feel kind of significant? Feel impressive? While Samuel gathers together the people, they're going to crown Saul king. And remember, Saul's already prophesied. You can't really make up prophesying, right? The Spirit of God has got to be upon you to prophesy. And people standing back are, wow, this is Saul. He's prophesying. Samuel gathers everyone to crown him king. But first, Samuel gives a speech. And so he goes in to how God has led Israel and how the nation of Israel is now demanding a king like the other nations, and God, being gracious, is going to give them a king. He gives them a warning that this king is going to take your sons and all your, I forget what, if he talks about using all your livestock in battle. But then he calls for Saul. I'm going to give you the king. And everyone's excited to see who Saul is, or to see who the king is. And he goes down through all the tribes, and then he goes down through the clans, and he gets to the Kish, goes down through his sons, and Saul's not there. And Samuel wonders, God, are you actually calling someone else? And God tells him, no, Saul's in the storage. Go find him there. And so they send men, they find him in the storage, and here he's hiding in the storage. Now, I admit, I would be afraid too, right? But the Spirit of God had already rushed upon him. He had already prophesied. Wouldn't that convince you that God is with you and that you are the king? What else might have been going on there? It's almost like he needed people to come and run, get him, and come back out and say, no, we want you king. And then the scriptures say, as they come back out, everyone's yelling, long live the king. That would be pretty reassuring, right? No, they didn't just, oh, I'm not there, so they're going to move on with the next guy. They come and got him, crowned him king, and everybody's yelling, long live King Saul. Put your hand over your heart. Feel the heartbeat. Take a deep breath. What keeps you going is something deep inside of you that has got to stay connected with God. It's not what you do. It's not how other people perceive you. But it's something else deep inside that must stay connected with God. So here's this guy from a very unimportant part of Israel. He's crowned king, and everybody's praising him. Everybody loves him. Scriptures also say he was a very handsome man, so he's good looking, he's gifted. And he goes out. Samuel said he would save Israel from their enemies. And sure enough, he does. He goes out and he saves them from their enemies. And everybody's excited. Everybody admires him. And so they gather together at Gilgal. Now, Samuel had said Saul could do anything the situation called for, except offer the sacrifice. He was supposed to go to Gilgal and wait 7 days, and then Samuel would come and offer the sacrifice, and that would be God's blessing being poured out on Saul and his army. But he's gathering his men at Gilgal, 3,000 men. How would you love to have an army of 3,000 men who just, whatever you do, they're there to do it for you? They gather together, they're excited, they had just defeated their enemies. What they don't realize is that the Philistines, they're coming for revenge. And they had mustered together 30,000 men, 10-1. Scriptures say, as the sand on the seashore in multitude. And when Saul's men looked up and saw they were surrounded by the Philistines, it says they began to scatter. They panicked. And in that moment, we see Saul do something. Something inside of Saul realized he was about to lose something he could not live without. Instead of everyone running to him and pulling him out of the storage and saying, "We want you king," they're now afraid and they're scattering. And so Saul, as he says later, he forced himself to offer the sacrifice because Samuel wasn't coming. So he offers the sacrifice, the one he wasn't supposed to offer, because he wanted God's blessing in battle. But you know what's interesting? When you read that in 1 Samuel 9, the first thing Saul says, when Samuel comes and says, "Saul, what have you done?" The first thing Saul says is, "I saw the men were scattering." You see, there is a shame deep inside of us. And that's the root of our sin. We as men desperately try to cover that shame. When we can't cover it, we'll even disobey God. The admiration of men and the confidence of his men had become a covering. It made him feel good. But now they were scattering. He saw they were scattering. Saul had not come, and he wanted God's blessing in battle, so he forced himself to offer the sacrifice. That one act cost him the kingdom. Saul's family would not go on to be royalty in Israel again. It would be transferred over to David. Each of us carry this shame. It's not unique to Saul. It's not unique to you and me. In fact, it goes the whole way back to Adam and Eve. At the very beginning, it says Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, and they were naked with God, without shame. Now, I don't know about you, but we're all men here, so we can talk about this, I think. Imagine yourself getting naked just by yourself. Do you feel comfortable at that? Let alone with another person, let alone with God. They were naked with each other and with God, and they didn't have any shame. Why? Why is that? Why didn't they have shame? Well, we know the theological answer, there's no sin. But what does that mean? What does that look like? You know, what I think Moses is trying to communicate when he says that Adam and Eve were in the garden and they were naked and unashamed. I think of myself standing in front of a mirror after a shower. I'm naked, and I'm not comfortable looking in the mirror. It's one of the most vulnerable things I can do. And you know why I think it's vulnerable? Is because in front of the mirror, I realize that being 28 and having 3 kids, I actually am getting kind of a middle-aged pudge, even though I can hide it pretty good under a decent shirt. In front of the mirror, I see that my 2 front teeth are still as crooked as they were in high school. In front of the mirror, I see that my back is peppered with moles, and it's not that impressive. And I desperately want to impress people. And being naked, I can't impress people. And I think the reason Adam and Eve were unashamed when they were naked with God is because they weren't using their bodies to impress people. They were so obsessed with God. Their focus was on God. They were worshiping God. They didn't even realize their nakedness. And the reason I say this is because after the serpent gets them to buy in and eat the fruit, it says their eyes were opened and they saw that they were naked. And then they go and try to cover themselves. There's something about this separation from God that causes us to begin to look to ourselves, and we realize our vulnerabilities, and then we try to cover up. It's at the core of our being. And it drives everything we do. Let's think about this for a little bit. What had God told Adam and Eve? Had God restricted Adam and Eve? Would you say when your understanding and memory of Genesis 1 through 3, is God restricting Adam and Eve? I think I heard an answer, but yes or no? No. He gave them everything. There's that one thing he told them not to eat, but why not to eat that? Because they would die. Something in them would die. He cares very much about their life. And I'm guessing here today, most of us come from Christian homes or from homes that taught about God. And my guess is most of us have kind of a subtle, it's always been this way, impression of God, that God's looking at you, wanting you to improve yourself. You're not quite there. God's looking at you, just waiting to say, oh, yeah, you can't enter heaven. There's this impression that God doesn't actually care about me. But that's not the impression Scripture gives. God cares very much about you, very much about your life. And as our creator, as the designer of all of life, he has told humanity how you can have the best life. But you can't eat of the knowledge of good and evil. And there's a lot of mystery wrapped up in that one command. Why? Why didn't you just create a world where there was no knowledge of good and evil and we can just eat everything else? And maybe it's because just like we in relationships, we would rather someone choose us. I would rather my wife choose me as her husband instead of any of you. Like that makes me feel better, as if it was me the only option and she chose me, then okay, cool. Do you get what I'm saying? Maybe, I don't know, but maybe God's wanting us to choose him, to choose that relationship. And so there is that option, that mysterious option. But for whatever reason, we know that option is there. But he made it clear that option would lead to death, not life. Not the thing we're actually looking for. The serpent comes along and he says, wait a minute. God actually knows that when you eat that, you'll become like him. And he doesn't want you to experience that. And so this idea that God doesn't actually care about my best begins to percolate. And all of a sudden, Eve sees the fruit is good. And it's able to make me wise. So she eats it. Adam eats it. And then they die. And humanity dies, right? That's not the story. So, is the serpent right? Oh, they won't actually die. Or is the death wrapped up in the fact that their eyes were open and they saw that they were naked, and all of a sudden, that relationship where they're obsessed with God, and it's like, I've got a 5 and 4 and 1-year-old son, and at this point in life, I can basically do no wrong. They look at me with utter admiration. They love when I come home. That was kind of their relationship with God. There was nothing they were hiding. My sons can't lie to me. It's hilarious sometimes how they'll come and confess their faults. That's the relationship they had with God. But that was broken. And now they're looking at each other and realizing they're naked, realizing they're vulnerable, and they go to try to cover themselves. When I was 18 years old, actually before 18, about 16 or 17, I started writing. 16 or 17, I went through a really dark season of life. Our church had some really difficult struggles. Dad was pastor, and Dad and Mom were processing a lot. My two older siblings were gone at Bible school, and I felt alone in many ways. I felt isolated from some of my friends because they were on opposing people that were opposing my dad as pastor. And so I started journaling, and it became a way of release for me. I'm a writer now, but I hated school, and I'm not a big reader. So writing is definitely a passion of mine because you don't have to be smart or academic or enjoy just sitting around in order to write. I actually write most of my things standing up, walking around. Writing became an avenue for me to process life. It was an avenue through reading scripture and then journaling. God would speak to me. And I began leaking some of these things on a blog that I had online. And people would be like, wow, that's really good, Asher. I remember when I was 18 years old, my aunt, we were visiting their house and we were leaving. And my aunt looked me in the eyes and she said, God has his hand on you, Asher. And he's going to do great things through the church, in the church through you. And I had never had anybody call something out like that in me before. I was a pretty good athlete. I was fast. I was good at baseball. I was good at hockey. I don't know if you guys play any of those things around here, but people had called that stuff out in me. But writing, doing something great in the church, somehow that felt more noble, like more worth spending my life doing, right? And what happened is I just continued to lean into that. I continued to write. I had a lot to process. And as I continue growing, I have more, even not just dark struggles, but more things I'm learning. And I write more and I blog more. And then I hear people coming and saying, yes, thank you for writing. Thank you for putting into words things I feel, but I couldn't put into words. Before I knew it, writing had become this thing that made me feel like I had value, made me feel like I was someone. Just like Saul, the king being called into kingship. And here's the thing about these fig leaves or these covers, whatever we want to call them, is it usually is things God has gifted us for, God has called us to. God's Spirit is upon us in. But because that thing is disconnected at the core of our being, we lean into that calling to give us the identity that only God can give. Some of you might be here and maybe it's not writing. I don't know that there's any kings here. But maybe it's work. You are really good at your job. Maybe it's knowledge. You're the guy. Everybody looks, if they want to know something about it, you go to this guy and he knows everything. Maybe it's winning an argument. You are driven to win the argument because when you lose an argument, you feel like a failure. Maybe it's sports. Every one of us have something that we tend to lean into to make us feel like we're somebody, to make us feel like our world is okay. Because deep in the core of our being, our world's not okay. We've been severed from this relationship with God. And we're longing to know that we're okay. We have our dad's okay with us. Think of the baptism with Jesus. Jesus comes out and the dove comes down and God says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." This is intrinsic in each of us to have belonging. Whose son? It's my son. To have value. How much is he worth to you? He's my beloved son. And competence, to feel like we have something to offer. I'm well pleased in him. I think we're all driven to find that. And we go out looking. We don't have that. We're not in Eden anymore. We don't feel that affirmation. And so we go out in the world looking for these things that make us feel like we have value. But the problem is, we can't fix it ourselves. Just like Saul with his men, he was gathering together. It was the height of his authority. They're gathering at Gilgal. Everyone's excited. They just defeated their enemies. And then they look up and realize they're under threat. Big time. And all of a sudden people realize, you know what? I don't know if Saul can save me. And so they're gone. And the thing that was saving Saul is gone. The admiration of men. And we can know what we're looking to for admiration when we don't have it anymore. When somebody else comes in who's just as good of a writer or better, and people bless them, do I feel threatened? Do I feel kind of jealous? Anger and jealousy will tell us right away where our coverings are. Because when we feel angry or when we feel jealous, it points to things in our life that we are turning to instead of God. We are turning to this to try to make it feel whole again. Put your hand over your heart. Feel your heartbeat. Take a deep breath. There's something deep inside of you that keeps you going. And that something is broken from God. And we try covering that shame that we feel in that brokenness our own way. But the problem is it doesn't work. Just like Adam and Eve, they tried covering themselves with fig leaves. God had to cover them in skins. Just like Saul, he tried covering himself with the power of being king and the admiration of men, but the men ended up fleeing. In the same way, the thing we use to try covering usually ends up falling through. And so we turn to other things, turn to things that we can control, things we can handle completely on our own. I don't need anybody telling me I'm a good writer, that God has his hand on me, only to risk seeing them do that to somebody else. We turn to our sex, our sexuality. That's private. I can do that all by myself. And the thing that's so powerful about our sexuality is that it's woven into our whole being. It involves our mind. It involves our emotion. And it involves our body. And when we become sexually aroused, when you're looking at an image and you feel excited and you're kind of aroused, or when you're touching yourself and you become aroused, or you're thinking about things and you become aroused, what's happening is adrenaline is getting released in your body. Adrenaline is a hormone. I think we all know what adrenaline rushes are like, right? How many of you have had close calls on the highway and you didn't have a wreck and it felt really good, right? Whew. That's adrenaline. How many of you go snowboarding? I grew up going snowboarding. How many of you do jumps on snowboarding? I love getting tons of air because of the adrenaline rush. It feels really good. How many of you get up on stage or something else that's really risky and you feel like, whew, and then when you're done, whew, it feels really good. There's adrenaline involved. And in the same way, when we get aroused sexually, there's adrenaline involved. We're not so much after sex. Which is why if you try to battle this at that sex level, we're going to struggle. What we're after is the feeling we get. And here's the thing. God designed us to have a complete and whole feeling where we're completely unashamed and our world is totally okay. He gave that to us. We walked away from it. And now we're going around, we're trying all these kinds of different things to get it back. And we use ourselves, our own bodies, our own hormones to make us feel on top of our world again. There's a therapist, Susan Block. She has a quote I just wanted to read here. She's not a Christian. She has no interest in helping you know Christ. But I find it interesting what even the secular world knows about sexuality and how it's tied to all of who we are. She says sexual fantasies can be the keys that unlock the doors to your repressed personal history. They can help you cope with real-life problems or help you work through past trauma or abuse, operating like an erotic painkiller on negative, hurtful emotions. They help you cope with real-life problems or process past trauma. And when you and I are struggling with sexual sin of any kind, whether it's just in the thought life, whether it's just, maybe it's pornography, maybe it's masturbation, maybe you've molested other people, maybe you've had sexual interaction with other people. The reason we're doing that is most likely because there's an area of life we either feel pain or we just feel some kind of void and we're trying to fill it. Some of us don't even know all of that. We just feel things. And all we know is sexual things feel good. And so we use that to cope. So in the last 15 minutes here, I'd like to talk about what do we do with this. If the root of our problem with porn or our problem with lust of any kind is that there's a shame deep inside of us we're desperately trying to cover, but we can't, then how do we find healing from that? What do we as Christ followers do? People like Susan Block think it's okay. You just enter that. You just enter sexual immorality. That's a way of escape. What does Christ call us to? Does he call us to anything? Some of us grew up in this. We know pornography or we know sex outside of marriage is bad and stuff, but we have these feelings we're struggling with, and we're not even sure, like, does Jesus actually answer the question or the problem of pornography? Turn with me in your Bibles to Romans 5. And then be ready to turn to 2 Corinthians 5. In Romans 5, Paul says he's going over 1 through 8. He's like doing a history lesson with the church at Romans. And he's showing how God has called out Israel and how he's been working through Israel to save his people, to save humanity. And in Romans 4, he talks about how Abraham believed God. He was convinced that God actually would do what he had promised. And I'm curious if anybody knows or anybody remembers what God had promised. Yell it out if you do. Because if you're like me, you grow up in church and you kind of forget. You don't know. What had God promised? He would have a son. What was the other thing? Father of many nations. Blessing all nations. What's the blessing? Christ. Remember that serpent that lied to Adam and Eve? The promise is that someone's coming who's going to crush that serpent. And he's going to destroy the power of shame in your life. And he's coming through Abraham. And Jesus is that person who's coming to crush. And so just as Abraham had faith that God would actually bring that promise about, and then it was counted to him as righteousness, Paul is saying, when we believe that Jesus actually has crushed the serpent, it is counted to us as righteousness. And so Romans 5, therefore, having been justified by faith that Jesus has, we're not Abraham anymore. We're not anybody before Christ saying someone's coming to crush. Jesus has crushed the power. We have been justified by faith. Therefore, we have peace with God. You see, there's this conflict in our relationship with God since Adam and Eve. There's this uncertainty about whether or not Dad actually cares. Does Dad actually have our best in mind? It's not because Dad did anything. I'm using a capital D, by the way. It's because we said, wait a minute, maybe we could be Dad. And so now there's this conflict. And God loves us so much that he's sending someone to end this conflict. That we can have peace, that we can have that relationship where we're finding identity, where we feel delight from our dad. We don't have to lean into writing or to sports. We don't even need pornography to feel like our world's okay. Through Jesus Christ, we have peace with God. Turn to 2 Corinthians 5. Verses 14 and 15, Paul is talking to the church at Corinth. He says, for the love of Christ controls us. 2 Corinthians 5, 14 through 15. Having concluded this, that one died for all. Back in Romans 5, Paul explained how because Adam sinned and Adam died, all died. And then Jesus came, Jesus died, and he died for all. And then he lived. He obeyed God. He rose again, and so all can live. And he's rehearsing that again. Actually, this was probably the first time Paul had written. One has died for all. Therefore all died. And he died for all, so that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who died and rose again on their behalf. So Jesus comes and he died for us because of our sin, because of our saying, I don't think you have our best in mind. We're going to try doing it our own way. God comes after us through his son Jesus, and he dies for us. And then he rose again so that we can be delivered from this living for ourselves. The issue of lust is an issue of living for myself. It's an issue of looking to myself. The issue of Adam and Eve seeing their nakedness and then trying to cover is an issue of them living for themselves instead of for God as they were designed. And so Jesus died so that we can live for him. So that we can have that perfect relationship again. Jesus says in John 8, verse 31, I think it is. John 8:31. He's telling his disciples, if you continue, actually he's talking to the Jews, if you continue in my word, then you are truly disciples of mine, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Now, did you know Jesus is not saying if you continue in the scriptures, then you will know concepts of truth, and those concepts of truth will lead you to freedom? Because sometimes that's how we read that. And we think that if we memorize a little more scripture, then I can combat pornography. I can combat my masturbation. And if you're like me, you're sitting there reciting verses you had memorized while masturbating. And that doesn't work very well. Something's not working. Jesus is saying, if you continue in what I have told you, you will get to know me. and I will set you free. He confirms this. 4 verses later, he says, who the Son sets free is free indeed. So he inserts himself. I'm setting you free. It's interesting. Amos and Dad and I were talking earlier, and Amos pointed out how the word, whenever it talks about Adam knowing Eve or Joseph did not know Mary, is the same word. Correct me if I'm wrong. Let me see if I get this right. Is the same word that when Jesus looks at someone and says, I don't know you. I haven't known you. The word that's used in a sexual context, knowing Eve, not knowing Mary, is the same word used of Jesus in whether or not he knows us. What we're longing for is this connection with God. And that thing that keeps you going deep inside, your body, it's the heart, your soul, it's a connection with God. And when that is broken, we feel ashamed deep inside of ourselves. And we go to anything we can control to try to cover that shame. When I was sitting in my office and that text had come in and I was thinking about what in the world, why does this excite me? I realized as I thought about it that a couple days before, my wife and I had had a date, and she shared some very difficult things with me. It was one of those conversations where I came away feeling like a failure. How many of you other husbands have had similar conversations? How many of you have ever come away feeling like a failure? It was good. It's not her fault that I was discouraged. She needed to share what she was sharing. But it was clear that I wasn't even living up to my own ideals. And that's actually probably what discouraged me even more. And I realized that this fling of a text, it's not even a real person, but this concept of someone wanting me at a very intimate level in a moment when I was kind of vulnerable. I was a little discouraged about myself as a person, about my marriage, about my leadership. And this little idea, it's just an idea. There wasn't even a person behind that. This idea offered to help me cope with a problem. And I realized that what I was actually wanting was to know that I'm okay with Dad. That even in my fumbling around trying to lead our family, Dad's still looking at me saying, son, you are my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. And so I remember just kind of setting my hands on the desk and just saying, Jesus, I need you. I feel really empty. And would you just come and speak your life into me? I need to know that I'm okay with you. I've never had an experience like that, and it's kind of difficult for me to talk about it because there's no steps that I can give you. But there was something that instantly changed, even my desires inside of me. I was overwhelmed. Different verses came to mind, and just the reality of God's love for me. And it's okay. Even though I've got a lot to learn as a husband, even though I've got a lot to learn as a father, even though I've got a lot to learn as a man, I'm okay with Dad. And it took away that excitement because I was known and I was reconnected with Father. And the reason I had victory that day wasn't because I became so self-disciplined. The reason I had victory was so many times when I'm tempted with sin and I go into sin, I don't give space for my Creator to speak life into it. And that day I gave space and I met my Creator. I'd like you guys to put your hand to your heart again. Why don't you go ahead and stand and close your eyes. I don't know what you struggle with or what your journey is like right now. I don't know if you're struggling with just thought life. You want to follow God. You want to live purely, but there's so many things that threaten that peace, that thought life. And you're here, you just want to continue growing. Or maybe you're feeling all kinds of things and you don't have words for it and you're just trying to figure it all out. Or maybe you're like me and you've gotten into porn. You've gotten into things you know is wrong. Maybe you're here and you feel you've messed stuff so much. You've messed it up that it can never be repaired. But for each of you, the answer to the problem, to that shame deep inside, is to be reconnected with Father. And you can only reconnect with him if you come and you tell him what you're feeling, what you're wanting. And sometimes, I don't know why this happens exactly, but sometimes we get the impression that Dad doesn't care. Or Dad, I can't just walk up and just say, unless it's money, I can't just say, Dad, I need this, right? But let me just tell you a story. There was this father who had 2 sons. And they lived well. They lived in a fairly good home. They had servants. And the man was pretty wealthy. And they lived in a culture where men who were wealthy were well-dressed. They were dignified. They walked. They didn't run, because running showed a sign of weakness and fear. They lived in a culture that was surrounded by these pagan people, and you don't associate with them. And the one son came to the dad, and he said, Dad, thanks for everything you've given me. I want it now. I want to go. And normally, a son in that culture wouldn't have gotten that unless the dad had died. So essentially what the son said, Dad, I don't care if you're alive anymore. I just want what you have, and I want to go. God, our Father, has given us tremendous blessing in our sexuality. And what we tend to do is like, you know what, God, I don't care if you're here anymore. I'm just going to get my pleasure out of this, get my joy. The son goes off. It says he goes and squanders all the wealth that he was given. And the thing that's so painful about that is the dad probably had to sell some property to be able to give his son what he deserved, because a lot of his assets were probably in property. And so he sells some land maybe, gives his son the money, lets him go. The son goes and squanders it. And he ends up working in a pig farm. And in that culture, people who had pig farms were the pagans, the people that his family weren't supposed to associate with. And not only is he working there, but he's eating the food. And he remembers, you know what? The servants at my dad's house were better off than I am here. And so he goes to go home. He recites this confession. He wants to go through the ritual so that maybe he can get in as a servant. But Jesus said that while the son was yet a long way off, the father saw him coming, and he ran. He defied culture because his son was coming home. And not only that, he didn't even let him confess. He called for a robe and a ring, which meant he's restoring him as son. So he's not just a servant, he's a son. He's my son. And what's even worse about that is that means he gets another inheritance when the dad actually does die. And he rejoices. He calls his servants. He says, let's throw a party because my son who was lost has been found. And they throw this party, and the older brother comes back, and he gets angry. He gets mad. And, I would be kind of angry too if I was dutifully working for my dad, thinking that I'm going to get a certain inheritance. And the son who goes and squanders it all and doesn't work for dad comes back and is restored as son and now gets part of my original inheritance. I would be angry too. But the answer the Father gives? Jesus telling the parable in Luke 15. Jesus says the Father turns to his son. This is how the parable ends. He says, "Son, you have always been with me. And my son who was lost has now been found." The purpose wasn't where the inheritance would end up. The purpose was where the sons would end up. Were they in the Father's presence? And Jesus shares this in the context of being ridiculed for eating and sitting with sinners. And I think he's trying to give us a picture of God's heart for each of us. No matter where you've been, you can be with the Father again. And so the next time you're tempted to look at porn, to masturbate, whatever it is, just put your hand to your heart. Feel the heartbeat. And consider what else might be going on inside your heart. What are you actually wanting? Are you tired? Do you feel lonely? Are you not sure what your place is, what you have to offer, and you're feeling a little discouraged? You feel like a failure? Just tell Jesus that. Talk to God about that. And let him fill you with life. Let him speak life, affirmation, and power over you. Sit in worship. Read the scriptures. Read God's word. The Bible is a message of a loving God who created a people to have a loving relationship with. And that people turned their backs on him, slapped him in the face, and went running away. And he goes running ahead of them, continually trying to point back, but son, but child. And they just run past, and he goes running ahead again. But son, come. It's a loving God wanting that relationship with you. Tell him what you're wanting. Tell him what you're feeling. He'll speak to you. And if you see after this session, after listening to this, if you see areas of your life where you have been going to other things instead of God, you've been going to work or ministry or some skill you have, and that's what's made you feel valuable. Or maybe you've been just totally immersed in sexual immorality. And tell that to God too. Tell him you're sorry. Say, God, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for running away from you for so long. I want to live your way instead of my way. I've never done this before, but if it would be helpful for you to take a physical step, then feel free to come forward. And I know there's men here who want to pray for you and to walk with you. These men are local. They could potentially walk with you longer. I don't want you to come forward in hopes that somehow coming forward is going to change everything. What I want you to do is meet the Father. And if it would help to come and get prayer for that or to talk with someone, feel free to come forward. But I'm going to pray. And then why don't we just sing that song that Dad taught us last night? I say yes, yes, yes. And during that, if you would like to come forward, you can come forward. Father, thank you for your presence. Thank you for your grace and for allowing us to reconnect with you. God, I just ask right now that all walls can be broken down. There's a lot of lies that hound at us at times, and they feel more real than what's actually real. And God, I pray that your Spirit would sweep over and totally dismantle those lies. God, I pray that each one would feel safety in confessing things that are deep inside of them that they are so afraid to tell because they're afraid what other people would think. They're afraid of what their family might think. Lord, I just ask that today as they're talking with you, Lord, please fill them with your Spirit, your presence.